Maya Carter was a bright and cheerful 10-year-old girl who loved school. She always did her homework on time, listened carefully in class, and treated everyone with kindness. She enjoyed reading and wanted to be a writer when she grew up. But on this particular day, something happened that she would never forget. It was a regular school afternoon at Ridgewood Elementary, and Maya had just finished lunch in the cafeteria. She was laughing and talking with her friends when, by accident, her tray slipped from her hands. A full cup of juice spilled all over her uniform pants. The cold liquid made her jump, and her friends gasped. Some of them giggled a little, but no one made fun of her. Feeling embarrassed, Maya grabbed some napkins and tried to clean herself up, but the stain was too big. Her pants were soaked, and she knew she couldn't stay like that for the rest of the day. She needed a change of clothes. Maya's school had a spare clothes policy, meaning if a student had an accident, the office would provide something for them to wear. She had seen other kids borrow extra clothes before, so she wasn't too worried. She quickly went to her teacher, Ms. Reynolds, to explain what had happened. Ms. Reynolds, however, didn't seem to care much. She glanced at Maya's pants and frowned. "You can't sit in class like that," she said. "You'll have to go home." Maya felt her stomach drop. "Can I get some spare clothes from the nurse's office?" she asked hopefully. But Ms. Reynolds shook her head. "We don't have anything for you today. Just go home and change." Maya was confused. She had seen other students get spare clothes before. Why not her? She didn't want to argue with her teacher, so she asked if she could call her dad to bring her something to wear. "No need for that," Ms. Reynolds said, sounding impatient. "You live close by. Just go home and come back when you've changed." Maya looked down at herself. She couldn't go home like this. She was wearing a long jacket, but it wasn't enough to cover her completely. She felt exposed, uncomfortable, and embarrassed. She wanted to cry, but she held back her tears. With no other choice, she wrapped her jacket around her waist as tightly as she could and walked out of the school. The air outside was cold, and Maya felt small as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She kept her head down, hoping no one would see her like this. But as she walked through the neighborhood, she could feel people staring. Some cars slowed down, and a few neighbors looked at her with concern. Each step felt heavier than the last. She had never felt so embarrassed in her life. All she wanted was to go home, change her clothes, and pretend this never happened. But little did she know, this was only the beginning. Maya walked as fast as she could, holding her jacket tightly around her waist. Her heart was beating fast, and she felt her face burning with embarrassment. She had never imagined something like this would happen to her. She always followed the rules, did her best in school, and respected her teachers. But today, she felt small and helpless. The road home felt longer than usual. With every step, she felt more and more uncomfortable. She tried not to look at anyone, but she could feel people's eyes on her. A few kids playing outside stopped and stared. Some adults glanced at her, their expressions changing from confusion to concern. She kept walking, wishing she could disappear. As she turned the corner onto her street, she heard a voice behind her. "Maya, sweetheart, is that you?" She stopped and turned to see Mrs. Jacobs, her elderly neighbor. Mrs. Jacobs had been a teacher for over 30 years before retiring. She was kind, always smiling, and she loved to check on the kids in the neighborhood. Maya hesitated. She didn't want to talk to anyone, but she couldn't ignore Mrs. Jacobs, so she gave a small nod. "Yes, Mom." Mrs. Jacobs took a step closer, her eyes filled with concern. "What happened, dear? Why are you walking home like this?" Maya's throat felt tight. She didn't want to cry, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I had an accident at lunch. My teacher said I had to go home." Mrs. Jacobs frowned. "Didn't they give you something to wear?" Maya shook her head. "No. I asked, but my teacher just told me to go home." Mrs. Jacobs looked shocked. She glanced up toward the school, her expression changing to something Maya had never seen before. "Anger. That's not right," she said firmly. "They should have given you something. They've always had extra clothes for kids. This isn't okay." Maya didn't say anything. She just wanted to get home and change. But Mrs. Jacobs wasn't finished. "Does your father know about this?" Maya shook her head again. "Not yet. I was going to tell him when I got home." Mrs. Jacobs pursed her lips, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I think he needs to know right now." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She loved her dad, but she wasn't sure how he would react. He was always calm and thoughtful, but he didn't tolerate unfairness. If he found out what happened, he would not stay quiet. Mrs. Jacobs dialed the number, and within seconds, Maya could hear her father's deep voice on the other end. "Mrs. Jacobs, is everything all right?" Mrs. Jacobs took a deep breath. "Darius, I think you need to come home." Maya was sent back from school without proper clothing. "You need to hear what happened." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Maya heard her father say two words in a tone she had never heard before. "I'm coming." Darius Carter arrived home faster than Maya had ever seen before. His car pulled up in front of the house, and before the engine had even stopped, he was already out, his eyes searching for his daughter. Maya stood on the porch with Mrs. Jacobs, her jacket still wrapped tightly around her waist. As soon as her father saw her, his face changed. "Maya, baby, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Maya nodded, but she couldn't hold back the tears that had been threatening to fall. I just wanted to change," she whispered. Darius knelt down and gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said softly but firmly. Maya took a deep breath and told him everything. She explained how the juice had spilled, how she had asked for extra clothes, and how her teacher had refused and sent her home instead. She told him about the walk home, how people had stared, and how embarrassed she had felt. As she spoke, Darius's expression grew more serious. He wasn't just upset, he was furious. But he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't show anger toward Maya. Instead, he listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he stood up and turned to Mrs. Jacobs. "Thank you for calling me," he said. "This is completely unacceptable." Mrs. Jacobs nodded. "I agree. In all my years of teaching, I have never seen a child treated this way. Schools are supposed to take care of their students, not send them home like this." Darius took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I need to talk to the school," he said. "Right now." Maya hesitated. "Dad, are you mad at me?" she asked softly. Darius immediately turned back to her, his expression softening. "Oh, baby, no. I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at the people who treated you unfairly. You did nothing wrong." He hugged her gently. "You're my daughter, and no one gets to humiliate you like this." Maya felt a little better, but she was still nervous. She had never seen her father this serious before. Darius stood up, pulled out his phone, and called the school. His voice was calm but firm. "This is Darius Carter. I need to speak with Principal Whitman immediately." Maya and Mrs. Jacobs watched as he paced the porch, waiting. After a few moments, he spoke again. "No, I will not schedule an appointment. My daughter was sent home in an unacceptable manner, and I expect answers today." There was a long pause. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good. I'll be there in 20 minutes." He ended the call and turned to Maya. "Go get change, sweetheart. Then we're going back to the school." Maya's heart pounded. She had a feeling her father was about to do something big. And for the first time since the incident happened, she didn't feel ashamed anymore. She felt protected. Darius Carter walked into Ridgewood Elementary School with Maya by his side. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, filled with determination. He wasn't just a father today. He was a man on a mission. He had spent years fighting for justice as a lawyer, but today it was personal. Maya held his hand tightly as they approached the front office. She felt nervous, but having her father beside her gave her a sense of safety she hadn't felt earlier. She wasn't alone in this fight. As they stepped inside, the receptionist, Mrs. Lane, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting you today." Darius didn't waste time. "I'm here to see Principal Whitman. I spoke to him on the phone, and he's expecting me." Mrs. Lane hesitated, but before she could respond, the principal's door opened, and Mr. Whitman stepped out. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious expression. He looked at Darius, then at Maya, before motioning them inside. "Mr. Carter, please come in." Darius walked in first, Maya following close behind. As they sat down, the principal cleared his throat. "I understand there was a misunderstanding today." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "My daughter was sent home without proper clothing. She was embarrassed, humiliated, and forced to walk home like that. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Whitman. That's negligence." The principal sighed and folded his hands on the desk. "I agree that the situation could have been handled better." Darius's eyes narrowed. It should have never happened in the first place. He turned to Maya. "Sweetheart, tell Principal Whitman exactly what happened, in your own words." Maya swallowed and spoke quietly but clearly. She explained everything again. How she had the accident, how she asked for extra clothes, and how her teacher, Ms. Reynolds, refused to help and told her to go home. When she finished, Mr. Whitman nodded slowly. "Thank you, Maya." He turned back to Darius. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter. This situation isn't acceptable, and I will be speaking with Ms. Reynolds about it." Darius's expression didn't change. "Speaking to her is not enough. I need to know why my daughter was treated this way. I know for a fact that the school has extra clothes for students, so why was Maya denied them?" Mr. Whitman hesitated. "I don't have an answer for that yet." Darius leaned back in his chair. "Then find one. Because if I don't get real answers, I'll take this matter higher, to the school board, the district, and, if necessary, the media. My daughter will not be another ignored case." The principal's face grew tense. He knew Darius Carter's reputation. He wasn't just any angry parent. He was a powerful voice. Finally, Mr. Whitman nodded. "Give me 24 hours. I will personally look into this." Darius stood up. "I'll be waiting." He took Maya's hand, and together they walked out, knowing this fight was far from over. The next morning, Maya woke up feeling a little nervous. She didn't know what was going to happen at school, but she knew one thing for sure: her father wasn't going to let this go. At the breakfast table, Darius was already dressed in his suit, his phone buzzing with messages. Maya's grandmother, Nana Ruth, was sitting nearby, shaking her head as she listened to the story again. "Back in my day, we had teachers like that too," she muttered. "But times have changed. They can't treat children like this and expect to get away with it." Darius put down his coffee. "That's exactly what I plan to prove today." He kissed Maya's forehead. "Sweetheart, you don't need to worry about anything. Just go to school, hold your head high, and remember, you did nothing wrong." Maya nodded, feeling a little braver. When she arrived at school, things felt different. Some of the kids whispered when they saw her, and a few teachers gave her strange looks. Had they heard what happened? She walked to her classroom, and just as she was about to sit down, the door opened. Ms. Reynolds walked in. The room went quiet. The teacher's usual stern expression was still there, but there was something else too: nervousness. She glanced at Maya for a second, then looked away. "Class, take out your notebooks," she said quickly. Maya did as she was told, but she could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure why, but it felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Then, during lunchtime, she got her answer. Outside in the schoolyard, a few older kids were talking loudly near the benches. "Did you hear about Maya's dad?" One boy whispered. "My mom said he's a big-time lawyer. He's making a huge deal about what happened." Another girl nodded. "Good. That was so wrong. If that happened to me, My mom would have been at the school screaming. Maya felt her face heat up. She didn't want to be the center of attention, but she also felt a little proud. People knew what happened, and they cared. Just then, a voice called out from behind her. Maya. She turned around to see Mrs. Lane, the school receptionist, walking toward her. Your father is here. The principal wants to see you both in his office. Maya's heart started pounding. Was something happening? She followed Mrs. Lane to the office, and when she walked in, she saw her father sitting across from Principal Whitman. And next to him was Ms. Reynolds. Darius stood up and smiled at Maya. Come sit, sweetheart. She obeyed, sitting beside him as the principal cleared his throat. Maya, I wanted you here because this involves you, he said. Then he turned to Ms. Reynolds. Ms. Reynolds, do you have something to say? Maya's teacher took a deep breath. Then, for the first time ever, she looked Maya in the eyes, not as a teacher, but as someone who had made a mistake. I want to apologize. Maya couldn't believe what she had just heard. Ms. Reynolds was apologizing. She had never seen her teacher look so uncomfortable before. The whole room was silent, waiting for her to continue. Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat and folded her hands on the desk. Maya, I made the wrong decision yesterday. I should not have sent you home like that. I should have found a way to help you instead of making you walk home embarrassed. Maya didn't know what to say. She had never expected her strict teacher to admit she was wrong. Darius, sitting beside her, nodded but didn't look satisfied just yet. Why did you do it? He asked, his voice calm but firm. You knew the school had spare clothes. Why did you refuse to help my daughter? Ms. Reynolds hesitated. She glanced at Principal Whitman, who gave her a small nod, as if telling her to speak the truth. She took a deep breath. I was frustrated, she admitted. It was a busy day. I had a lot on my plate, and I wasn't thinking about Maya's feelings. I just wanted to get her out of class so I could continue my lesson. I thought it wasn't a big deal if she went home since she lived close by. Maya lowered her eyes. So that was it. She had been humiliated just because her teacher didn't want to be bothered. Darius let out a slow breath. Ms. Reynolds, teachers have a responsibility to care for their students, not just teach lessons but also protect their dignity. You didn't just inconvenience my daughter. You made her feel ashamed and alone. Do you understand that? Ms. Reynolds swallowed hard and nodded. I do now. Maya looked up at her teacher. For the first time, she saw something she had never noticed before: guilt. Ms. Reynolds looked truly sorry. Principal Whitman spoke next. Ms. Reynolds will be attending a mandatory training session on handling student concerns with more care and empathy. I will also be personally reviewing all student welfare policies to make sure nothing like this happens again. Darius crossed his arms. That's a start. Ms. Reynolds turned to Maya again. I know my apology won't erase what happened, but I want you to know that I regret my actions. I hope you can forgive me. Maya took a deep breath. She had been angry, embarrassed, and hurt. But sitting here, hearing her teacher admit her mistake, she realized something. Holding onto anger wouldn't change the past. She looked up and nodded slightly. I forgive you. A quiet sigh of relief passed through the room. Darius gave Maya's shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're strong, sweetheart. Ms. Reynolds gave Maya a small, grateful smile before looking down at her hands. Thank you, Maya. But just as things started to settle, Principal Whitman looked at Darius. Mr. Carter, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Maya and her father exchanged a glance. What else could there be? Darius shifted in his chair, his sharp eyes focused on Principal Whitman. Maya sat beside him, feeling a little uneasy. What else was there to talk about? Principal Whitman cleared his throat and folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Carter, while investigating Maya's case, I found something concerning. This isn't the first time a student has been denied help in situations like this. Darius's jaw tightened. Go on. The principal sighed. I checked past reports and spoke with some staff members. It turns out that there have been other students, mostly from certain backgrounds, who have been treated unfairly. Some were sent home for small accidents like Maya's, while others were given warnings for things that other students were simply helped with. It seems like a pattern, and that is not acceptable. Maya felt a chill run through her. She wasn't the only one. Darius sat back, his face unreadable. So, you're telling me this wasn't just an isolated mistake? Mr. Whitman shook his head. I'm afraid not. Ms. Reynolds looked down at her lap, clearly uncomfortable. Maya wondered if she was realizing how serious this was. Darius nodded slowly. And what are you planning to do about it? Principal Whitman straightened his back. Effective immediately, I'm implementing a new system where every teacher must report cases like Maya's to the office before making a decision. No child will be sent home unless absolutely necessary, and we will ensure that all students are treated fairly. Darius crossed his arms. That's a step in the right direction. But policies don't mean much if they aren't followed. How will you make sure this actually happens? The principal hesitated, then spoke with determination. I'll personally oversee this for the next few months. I'll check every report and make sure teachers are handling situations correctly. And he glanced at Ms. Reynolds. Any staff member found treating students unfairly will face consequences. Maya glanced at her father, waiting for his reaction. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. That's what I needed to hear. Ms. Reynolds finally spoke. I'll do better. She looked at Maya again. Not just with you, but with all my students. I promise. Maya gave a small nod. She wasn't sure if things would change overnight, but at least now someone was paying attention. Principal Whitman stood up. Mr. Carter, I want to personally thank you for bringing this issue to light. Most parents would have let this go, but because of you, we have a chance to fix something bigger than just one mistake. Darius shook his hand firmly. I fight for what's right. Always. As they left the office, Maya looked up at her father. Dad, I think you just changed this school. Darius smiled, putting an arm around her. No, sweetheart. We did. As Maya and her father walked out of the principal's office, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, pride, hope. Things were changing, and she had been a part of it. When they stepped into the hallway, a few students glanced at her, whispering to each other. Some of them gave her small smiles, and one girl even nodded at her in approval. People knew what had happened, and they saw that something was being done about it. As they reached the front entrance, Mrs. Lane, the school receptionist, stopped them. Maya, she said with a warm smile, you're very brave. What happened to you was wrong, but because you and your father spoke up, a lot of students will be treated better from now on. Maya smiled shyly. Thank you, Mrs. Lane. Darius glanced at his watch. You ready to go back to class, sweetheart? Maya hesitated for a second. A part of her wanted to just go home and rest, but another part of her knew she needed to face her classmates. She wasn't the same scared girl who had walked home embarrassed the day before. She was stronger now. She nodded. Yeah, I want to finish my day. Darius smiled with pride. That's my girl. He walked her back to her classroom, and just before she stepped inside, he bent down and whispered, If anything ever happens again, you tell me. No one gets to treat you unfairly. Got it? Maya nodded. Got it. When she walked into the classroom, everything went quiet for a moment. Ms. Reynolds looked up from her desk, meeting Maya's eyes. She gave a small, almost nervous smile and nodded slightly, as if to say, I meant what I said. Maya took a deep breath and walked to her seat. As soon as she sat down, her best friend, Jasmine, leaned over and whispered, You're like a hero now. Maya giggled. I don't know about that. Jasmine grinned. Well, you kinda are. You made a teacher apologize. I didn't even know they could do that. Maya laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in days. The rest of the school day went by smoothly. Ms. Reynolds was still her usual strict self, but there was something different in the way she spoke to Maya. Something softer. When the final bell rang, Maya grabbed her backpack and headed outside. Her father was waiting for her near the car, talking to another parent. When he saw her, he smiled. As she walked toward him, she realized something important. This wasn't just about her. It was about making things better for everyone. She climbed into the car, buckled her seatbelt, and smiled at her father. "Thanks for standing up for me, Dad." Darius started the engine and glanced at her with a proud look. "Always, sweetheart, always." As they drove away, Maya looked out the window, feeling stronger than ever. She wasn't just a little girl who got sent home without pants. She was someone who made a difference.